One of the earliest criticisms of Ajax was that it made it difficult to save state, quote unquote. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you have a link on your page, and when you click on it, it's going to bring in some data with an Ajax request, maybe from the Twitter API. Well, the problem is, from that point on, the visitor to your website has no way to link to that specific state in your web page. Now, since then, plenty of very smart JavaScript developers have figured out alternatives, so that's not really an issue anymore. But now with the HTML5 history API, we have this baked into the browser, and it's really neat. So let me give you a run through of how to use it. The basic idea behind the history API is that it now allows us to push new records to the browser's history. So for example, I have 3 links here, and each one is going to link to an image. So what we're going to do here is when I click on one of these links, rather than loading a whole new page, I instead want to display that image on the same page. And then I want to save a new record to the browser's history. And that way, when I click the back and forward button, I can switch between the different states on the page. Okay, let's get started. So here is what we're going to begin with. I have an unordered list that contains just a handful of list items here, and each list item again contains a link to a specific image along with a title. Very simple unordered list. Now let's get started working with the history API. Now this is not brand new to HTML5, it's simply been extended. So for example, for previous iterations of the history API, we could do things like moving forward. So I could say history.go, and I could say go -1, and that means go back 1 page. Or I could say go forward 2 pages. Or I can set that to 0 to reload the current page. Or, alternatively, I can also use forward to move forward a page and back to move backward a page. Now, those we've had access to for a long time, but now we want to take a look at the pushState method. So the pushState method is fairly simple. It allows us to push a new record to the browser's history. So the basic syntax is going to be history.pushState. And this method is going to accept a handful of parameters. The first one is going to be the data. What data are we going to be saving? And that way, when they click the back button, we can retrieve that saved data and use it to render the page however we need to. The second parameter is going to be a title, and this will be, for example, if I click on the back button, the title that you see right here. It will also be used for the title of the window. However, at the time of this writing, no browser currently supports it, but you definitely want to add that in there because they will eventually. And then finally, the URL. Whatever you type here is what's going to be displayed as the URL. So let's jump into this and try it out. I'm going to create a new record in the browser's history. And for now, I'm just going to write some data. We don't have anything, so we'll mock it. And we'll give it a title, my page title. And then finally, the URL, I'm just going to give it a name of page. Now, an important note, this is not going to work as is. If I reload the page, you're not going to see anything. And that's because for the history API to function correctly, it needs to be associated with a server rather than file. So you have a couple of solutions here. You can either take the files and upload them to your server, or you can use a local server. So for example, I do a lot of work with PHP, so I will boot that up, and I'll pause here, and then I'll transfer this file over to my local server project directory. There we are, and I've reloaded the page now on my local server, and now I want you to take note that it has run, and we've replaced the URL. Now it says /page. We can change this to anything we want. So my new page. And then I'll come back. And if I reload the page, now we can see we've called it my new page. Now this is an important thing to pay attention to though, and this is something that trips a lot of people up. The history API is not creating links for you. So even though we've rewritten this, this is not a link that you can suddenly email to your friends, even if it was stored on a server and not your local host. So if I paste that in, no, that's not going to work at all. That's why the history API should be used in connection with a server-side language. And that way, your server-side language should have the necessary code to take a URL like this and be able to decipher what to do. But that's beyond the scope of this tutorial because it depends on what language you prefer. Nonetheless, let's reload the page, and if I click back, you now see that we have links back to the previous pages. So I hit forward, and now we're going to this new state, and I hit back, and now we're going to the previous state. Now in the next lesson, I'm going to teach you how to listen for when these back buttons are pushed, because right now it doesn't do as much. We're hitting forward and back, but nothing is happening. We need to attach an event listener so we can hear when that button is pressed, and then we can act accordingly. And we'll do that in the next lesson.